All right, let's jump right in. India has just done a massive overhaul of its entire criminal code, bringing in the new Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, or BNS. Today we're going to zero in on one of the most critical parts of this whole change, how the law now defines and punishes crimes against women. So let's see what's actually different.
And that's really the core question, isn't it? We've all seen the headlines, but what has really changed on the ground? What new protections are actually in place for women, and what loopholes, if any, have been closed? Let's break it all down.
Okay, so let's dive right into the deep end with Section 63 of the BNS. This is a huge deal because it's a foundational change. The law doesn't just tweak the punishment for rape, it completely redefines the act itself, and in a much broader and more specific way than we've ever seen before.
You know, the new law is actually pretty methodical about this. It starts by defining the physical act of intercourse itself, and then it lays out the 7 specific conditions where that physical act becomes the crime of rape. So first, let's look at what counts as the physical act. The first one is the most direct and frankly the most commonly understood definition. Penetration by the penis into one of 4 parts of a woman's body: the vagina, mouth, urethra, or anus. It's a very clear and unambiguous starting point.
Now, this next part is so important, and you can see it's a direct response to the horrific details from cases like the Nirbhaya incident. The law now explicitly says that penetration with any object or any other body part also counts. This is an absolutely crucial expansion. It is interesting, though, you'll notice the mouth is specifically excluded from this particular clause.
Okay, and Clause C. This is critically important for protecting the most vulnerable, especially very, very young children. In awful cases where a child's body isn't developed enough for full penetration to even be possible, the act of manipulating their body parts to cause penetration is now legally defined as the same act.
And the final act that's defined is applying the perpetrator's mouth to the woman's vagina, anus, or urethra, or, and this is key, forcing her to do the same to him or to someone else. This makes sure that acts of forced oral sex are clearly covered under the law.
So what's really interesting here is that this slide is the legal trigger. I mean, those 4 physical acts we just talked about can of course be totally consensual between partners. It's these 7 circumstances right here, things like being against her will, or getting consent through fear, or if she's under 18, that legally transform that physical act into the crime of rape.
Wow. The source material uses this really stark, incredibly powerful analogy to explain a new and very severe punishment. Under the BNS, if a rape causes an injury that leaves the victim in what's called a persistent vegetative state, basically unable to function independently, like a human cabbage, the person responsible can now face the death penalty.
Now, the BNS doesn't just redefine old offenses. It actually creates entirely new ones. So let's take a look at 2 major additions: crimes that involve deceit, and how the law now deals with crimes committed by a group.
Okay, Section 69. This is brand new and, honestly, a little controversial. It criminalizes getting sex through deceitful means, so lying about your identity or faking a job offer, and crucially, it also includes making a false promise of marriage when you had no intention of ever going through with it. The idea is to protect women from this kind of exploitation, but the sources we looked at also raise concerns that it could be misused in situations like, relationships gone bad.
So let me throw a scenario at you. This gets right to the heart of a major legal question that the new law, Section 70, is trying to clear up. How do you handle accountability when a crime is committed by a group of people? Well, the answer is way more comprehensive than you might think.
And here is the answer, straight from the law. It all comes down to a legal principle called common intention. Basically, everyone who is involved is held equally responsible. The key isn't whether you performed the physical act itself. If you were there to help, if you were the lookout or you guarded the door, you are just as guilty because you shared the criminal intent.
Okay, let's shift gears now and look at offenses that happen within the context of marriage. The BNS updates the laws on bigamy and cruelty, and it gives us some really clear legal tests for what actually makes something a crime. To prove the crime of bigamy under the new Section 82, the law sets out this clear 3-part test. First things first, the original marriage had to have been legally valid to begin with. So, for example, if it was void from the start for some reason like incest, a bigamy charge just won't stick.
Second, and this one is pretty straightforward, the first spouse obviously has to still be alive when the second marriage happens.
And third, a formal second marriage ceremony has to actually be performed. And this is a really key distinction. Just living with another partner, that's not enough to trigger this specific law. There has to be a ceremony.
And the law also closes a really common loophole, and we have a landmark case to thank for that. It basically established that you can't just get around bigamy laws by converting to a religion that permits multiple marriages. The law of your first marriage is what counts, so a second marriage would still be illegal. Pretty smart.
Finally, let's look at Section 86, which clarifies the two different kinds of cruelty. Type A is what they call willful conduct. So any behavior that's so severe it's likely to push a woman towards suicide or cause serious physical or mental harm. Then you have Type B, which is much more specific. It's harassment that's directly linked to illegal demands for dowry.
So we've broken down a lot of these specific sections. What does it all really add up to? Let's do a quick recap of the biggest, most crucial takeaways from our look at the new Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita.
So if you remember anything, remember this. The definition of rape is way, way broader now. There are totally new offenses on the books, like having sex based on deceit. The law is now crystal clear that in a gang rape, if you share the intent, you share the guilt. And finally, crimes that happen within a marriage now have these really precise legal tests that have to be met in court.
And that really brings us to the final, and I think the most important, question of all. On paper, the BNS is a major step forward. We've got clearer definitions, tougher penalties, but the ultimate test isn't what's written in the law books. It's what happens on the streets in our homes. Can these new laws actually create a safer society for women? Now that is the real challenge. Thanks for watching The Explainer.